everyone. This demo video is going to be for the yellow object painting. You can set up your own yellow objects at home. I will be, or you can use the photo references I'm providing with a grapefruit and a yellow cloth, both of which are kind of on the yellow end of the color wheel spectrum. The grapefruit is leaning more towards kind of a yellow-orange. The yellow cloth is more of kind of a warm primary yellow. These are the colors that are going to be on our palette. I'm arranging them in a way where I can see their color relationships. When you're putting your colors at the top of your palette that you'll be mixing down from, you want to think almost like you're taking the color wheel, you're taking it apart into a line, and that's what you're unfolding onto your palette, okay? So we have Cadmium Yellow. This is our bright and chromatic yellow. This is going to be highly useful today and something we'll be using as a way of lightening our warmer colors. Okay, I'm going to keep all this paint out because I will probably need more as I mix. Yellow ochre. Yellow ochre is a earth tone, more neutralized yellow, so you can definitely see that when it's next to the cadmium. It is not nearly as chromatic. Okay, it's also a bit warmer than our cadmium yellow. Burnt umber. Burnt umber is going to be an important one today for mixing a cool neutral with ultramarine blue to address our white cloth background. Okay, so burnt umber. Burnt umber is also kind of acting like a very neutralized orange. Cadmium red. We're not going to be using a ton of this today, but there will be, so I'm just going to put a little bit out on my palette. But we are going to use that to warm up the yellows for the grapefruit a bit, and then also the alizarin crimson. I'm going to use just a little bit of that, so just putting a little bit of these reds out on the palette. You can put more out if you need, but start with a smaller amount because we'll use them to warm up parts of the grapefruit, but we don't need a ton. Alright, ultramarine blue. Again, that's going to combine with the burnt umber to create a cooler neutral to address our white cloth in the background. Okay, so we'll essentially just be making a gray value strain, cool neutral with the ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And of course, white. So we have a white cloth background, so we're going to mix a whole value scale of gray to address that. We will be using a little bit of white, both for part of the grapefruit where there's more of a highlight and to lighten the yellows a little bit, but we are going to be conservative with our use of white when we're mixing a warm color because it can change the temperature. So rather than just using white as a way of lightening the values for our warmer object, we're going to be using the cadmium yellow to also help us with that, to help it to stay warmer. Okay, and then putting out some solvent-free gel. Also, I wanted to talk briefly about my palette. What I'm using for today's mixing demo is a piece of glass where I have painted the back with a mid-tone gray. So this means that what I'm mixing my colors out on will also kind of match the mid-tone of my canvas, which is nice. It can kind of lead to more accurate colors. It's also with the glass, when I'm done painting, I can just scrape that down. This is a paint scraper, so there's a razor blade that fits in here. You can scrape that paint off and reuse it. So you have the disposable palettes in your kits, this is something you could get eventually. If you decide you really want to continue painting, then you can go for something that's reusable. Okay, so let's begin with just our cool neutral. So we'll just mix out, get some of the burnt umber, and I'm just going to mix out maybe 5 different values with this. Just want to give myself a variety. I'm looking at my still life setup. See some mid-tone grays, some brighter lights. Let's get a little bit more blue. There's some occlusion shadows where the forms are hitting the white cloth. So I'll definitely want to save some of this pure neutral I'm mixing here at the top to address those shadows. Parts of the cast shadow can get quite dark as well. So I want to mix out at least a few different options of values to address all those different parts of the shadow and light that I'm seeing. And you've now had practice in mixing out those 10 different values, so you can continue to do that. You don't necessarily have to do that every time. It can just really depend on what you're seeing within your setup, but it's good to have that ability to mix a whole spectrum of values to be using to give yourself lots of different options. Okay. These palettes, it can also be kind of easier to scrape up the paint and put it in a new spot. Should be nice. Okay, so let me test this a little bit to see if I like the ratio of burnt umber and blue. So the white is going to help me see. Yeah, that will work. Okay, so I'll begin like I have in previous demos with our neutral value scales and our black and white value scales, where I'm going to start by mixing more of a mid-tone gray that I can then customize on each side. Grab some more white. And as always, I have my paper towel handy. I'm wiping off my palette knife in between uses so I'm not contaminating my colors, my pure colors at the top. So mixing paint is all about trying to have a strategy in mind and a game plan in mind for your painting. So you're trying to stay relatively organized, and that's going to simplify the painting process for you. You can keep your palette relatively organized. Okay, so that's a nice little mid-tone. Trying to kind of scrape that up. Okay, all right. So now I'm just going to mix a few values going each way, and then we will move on to mixing out our yellows. I also have a green that I will be mixing because in the scenario that I've just set up, the grapefruit has a leaf. You can choose to work from one of those references if you want to, or you can do the leafless grapefruit. That's totally fine too. All right, I'm just gonna mix one more darker value. And then as I'm painting, if I realize that I need more dark values to work with, I'll pause and I'll go ahead and remix those out. Okay, so mixing a bunch of white into that. And also, guys, as I'm mixing, when I finish mixing a little color, I kind of like to gather it up and put it into a little pile with some height. So that's going to stay wet longer than if you've really flattened out your mixture of paint. Okay, I'm gonna grab some of that and mix my way up this value scale. Grab some of that. I'm also going to grab some of this lighter mixture as well. Mix that into this next one. Okay, now I'm going to go to the darker side. And again, if needed, you mix out your paint, you have this strategy in mind, and as you're painting, if you realize, oh, I really need a couple more values within here, pause and return to your palette and make that adjustment. So pre-mixing things, it's never going to be perfect or exactly right. It's you're trying to come up with a strategy and a game plan, and that might work really well right away, but sometimes you begin painting and then realize, okay, I need to adjust some things with my palette here. So always keep that in mind. So, and you may also be following along with my demo, and the demo will get you most of the way there, but you also have to be approaching things and making your own painting and assessing things for yourself as well. So this isn't just a sort of paint by numbers scenario where you're emulating me exactly. You also have to be looking at the value structure of your reference, assessing it, follow along with the demo as much as you can, but then also see what's coming up for yourself in your painting as you're working, and be consciously thinking of the colors you're mixing out and the values, and addressing those different parts of the shadow family and light family. So you also have to be really actively thinking as you're painting and returning to your mixing. Okay, so have a nice spectrum of a cool gray made from ultramarine blue and burnt umber to address the tablecloth. Now I'm going to think of my yellows, and before I get into my yellows, I need to create a purple in order to neutralize my yellows. So, so that's just using the complement to create a neutral. So I'm going to do that starting with some ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson, and I'm going to do a little bit of cad red in here as well. Okay, so mixing out a purple. This is going to be a very dark mixture, which is totally fine. And I'm actually going to mix a few lighter versions of this purple, just because there's a small portion on my grapefruit at the very top that has a kind of purple, light purpleness to it. So I'm mixing some lights into mixing some white into another little pile of the purple will help me to really gauge the color of this. Now I'm not going to add white into all of this mixture because I want this deep dark purple to use to neutralize my yellows. I do not want to add white into that. So I will be adding white into a separate pile, but don't add white to the entire thing. There's no reason to do that. So let me just test this out a bit. So I'm putting some of my purple down. Gonna grab some white. Okay, I like that. That will work. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it at that. So I now have a purple to use, which I'll be taking and using, adding to my yellows to create the shadows. So the purple is going to neutralize it and darken it and give me some nice neutral yellows to work with for the shadows. Okay, I'm going to start by mixing out the color for the yellow cloth. So I'll do the yellow cloth right here. That yellow cloth is going to be closer, it's going to be closer to this cadmium yellow, so I'll kind of orient it right here. And then I will be mixing the grapefruit, which is kind of a yellow orange. It's even a little bit pinkish too. So that's kind of acknowledging that these different colors, there's a gradient to color. It's not always just, oh, this is yellow, this is red. There are colors that kind of exist in between, and the grapefruit is a good example of that, where it's kind of yellow, kind of orange. There's parts of it that are even kind of a little bit pink. So that's going to be closer to this range because there's going to be more of these reds combined with the yellows for that grapefruit. And to begin mixing with this, I'm going to start by thinking of the local color. So that is the color of the object under a direct light. So if you're looking in the whole kind of light mass, what color do you see? So that's the color of the object, right? And then I'll be mixing out lighter and darker versions from the local color. So it's kind of like how we begin by making a mid-tone gray, and then you adjust the other versions of it to make this value scale. We're kind of taking a similar approach. So I'm going to start with some cadmium yellow. Okay. And this is a very bright and kind of cool yellow, and the cloth is a bit warmer. So I'm also going to add some of my yellow ochre. It's a bit warmer, it's also a bit more neutralized than this. I'm going to add that, and then I'm also going to add a little bit of this cad red, which has a very warming effect too. So let's begin with that and see what this looks like. That is fairly close. This mixture I have is maybe a little too warm, so I'm going to mix more cadmium yellow into it. And it's okay if you start with kind of a bigger pile of paint, because just like in this scenario where you're using the mid-gray and you're customizing it kind of on each side, I'm going to be doing a similar thing. So I want to mix enough of this local color to be able to also create shadows from it and some lighter values from it. Okay, so I'm going to mix in more of the cadmium yellow into this to brighten it up a bit and to get it a little bit cooler than it is right now. Okay, that's much closer to our local color. All right, so this is a good starting place. Okay, so I'm going to take some of this and I'm going to do a few more values up here. Okay, and then same thing going the other direction. A few values going down here. Okay, to address the shadow areas that I'm seeing. So now I'll start with the shadow end. So I'm going to get some purple. Make sure I wipe off my palette knife before I go to get that purple. So I'm grabbing some purple to neutralize it. Now with a yellow, when it goes darker, it's going to get more neutral and it can end up looking like a brown. It may look odd on your palette, but it can work on the painting. So especially if you're new to painting, that can feel really weird to see these colors that happen with yellows. But that is just part of mixing out yellows. Now, if you're mixing out, if you mix out one of your colors over here and it ends up looking really green, well, that is telling you that there's too much blue and yellow in the mixture. So there's maybe too much blue in your purple. And that to neutralize that, if it's looking overly green, you're going to add a little bit more red. I think mine is looking okay. I might still add a little bit more red into it. But it actually looks fine. It just sort of looks like black. So, but if you mix something out and it looks really green, remember your color wheel. Okay, the way you neutralize something is by adding the complement. So if it's going green, add red. Something's going too blue, add orange. Something is too yellow, add some purple. Okay. If the goal is to neutralize it, that is. Okay, so now I'm gonna take this shadow color I've mixed and I'll start mixing up my value scale to get some different values going. So this combination here is looking a little too green. I'm going to add a little bit of red into it. So you could add both a little bit of burnt umber and cadmium red. I'm going to start with the cadmium red just a little bit. You don't want to overwhelm your mixture. Also remember, as you are mixing, to squint at your value scales. Now we're adding another layer of information with color, so that can be kind of a juggling act to be both considering color and to be considering value. But you also just need to make sure that your values are reading, and the way to check that is squinting. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more of this mixture into here. That's giving me another step in my value scale. Okay, so now I'm going to just continue mixing up. Okay. Alright, so I have some shadows to work with, and I may even mix a darker shadow for a really dark part of the shadows, like the occlusion shadows. There's one at the bottom of the grapefruit on that cloth. I'm going to grab some of that. I'm going to add a little bit more purple into it and even a little bit of this cool neutral. So that's going very dark. This would be a good occlusion shadow value. Okay. Now going to the light end. So I'm going to begin on the very top and adding more cadmium yellow into the mixture to brighten it and lighten it. So these are for the areas that are brighter but still chromatic and warm. There are some areas that are getting some highlight where there's more of a kind of white in it. So I'm going to take a little bit of this and put some right there to add white into. But for the more chromatic lights that are staying warm, I'm using the cadmium yellow as a way of lightening. Okay, let's mix that down. Alright, so let's add a little bit of the white into this mixture for areas of more kind of intense highlight. So this is not going to be all over the light. You have to really observe, pause and look at your reference and ask yourself what color and value you are seeing. So it might still be a very light value, but it might still be very chromatic. Then you're going to be using that. If it's reflecting back the light source, you're going to get parts that maybe go more like this because the light source is a white kind of natural light source. It's a natural light bulb, so the temperature of the light is very close to white, kind of a cool white. Okay, so now we have some yellows to address our yellow cloth. Now let's look at that grapefruit. So we're looking at that grapefruit and we're sort of asking, okay, what colors do I see in there? So it's kind of an yellowy orange pink color, and it's a little bit neutralized too. Okay, so we are going to use a little bit more cadmium yellow. Let me put more of that onto my palette. More on my palette. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the cadmium yellow. Not as much as this yellow, because it's not as chromatic of an object. I'm going to get some of this yellow ochre, which is a warm, more neutralized yellow. And this is a good example of how when yellows in particular get darker, they're going more neutral, it's going more towards brown. And that happens to yellow pretty quickly as you're getting the darker values because it is such a light color. When you darken it, it starts to look very brown. Okay, now I'm gonna add, so it's also a little bit orangey, a little bit pink, right? So I'm gonna add some cadmium red and a little bit of alizarin crimson too, which is our cooler red on our palette. So let's begin with this, see what it looks like, and see if we need to add other things into the mixture. Now with the grapefruit, I'm both going to use yellow and white to lighten it. There are parts of the grapefruit where it's reflecting back the light source. So again, it's picking up that bright white light nature of the light source, which is like white. So the white is fine to use there. And it is a more neutral yellow. So it doesn't need to stay super, super chromatic like this one where I was working with a really chromatic yellow object. The grapefruit's a little bit more neutral. So adding white into this, I don't want to overdo it, but it's not going to totally change the nature of the color. Okay, let's add a little bit more cadmium yellow into this and a little bit more cadmium red. So this is a part of mixing. You're sort of asking yourself what color you're seeing. You're thinking of the hue, the value, the temperature, the chroma, and you start to mix out and sort of see see how close you can get. Okay, this is pretty good. So I'm going to put, just like I did over here, some notches of this going this way for shadows and going up for more light. And again, we'll begin with the shadows and with adding purple into our yellow orange. Another way of neutralizing colors too is you can mix out a neutral like that and just add that neutral into it. So that's that can work, or mixing the complementary color. And always, always, always think of your color wheel. So if you're mixing out that color and it looks strange, it's leaning too much towards one color, remember that you can pop the complement in there and get it more towards the neutral you're looking for. Okay, so, and that's important to remember, because if you're mixing out a yellow and you're trying to neutralize it and it's looking too green, adding more yellow is not going to fix that, because there's too much yellow and blue in it. That's what's making it green. So you need to neutralize that green with a red of some sort. Okay, so let's put a couple of steps going down for the shadows and a couple of steps going up for the light, just like with our other value scales. And I'm going to put one right here to add a bunch of white into. Okay, so I have a fairly good local color. It's a little bit dark, so I'm going to be getting some of the other lighter tints that I need by adding yellow and white. Let's begin with the shadow side. So grabbing a bit of purple, adding that in. Okay, that's a nice color for the core shadow. Now, I think I may want even more of this shadow, so I'm going to get a little bit more paint to work with. So I'm going to bring more down here and add in more of this purple. So I want to make sure I have enough paint to finish my painting. It can be really aggravating to try to remix a color exactly. And oil paint you can save for a while, so if you over mix some colors, maybe just use them in another painting, use them to tone another canvas. You can even combine all of your paint at the end and make some grays to tone canvases with, or you could try toning a canvas with the color. But I kind of prefer erring on the side of mixing a little bit more paint, and I always like to just use it for another painting if I need to, rather than mixing tiny, tiny piles and having to remix, try to match my colors. That can be really aggravating. Okay, I have a nice core shadow value and color to work with. I give myself a few more shadow variants. Shadow, kind of mid-tone. All right, so now let's mix our lighter versions. So again, I'm going to be using both yellow and white to make some of the lighter values for my grapefruit. So let's start by adding the cadmium yellow into there and some white. And let me get some more white on my palette. Okay. Right, so let's see what that looks like. May need to add a little bit more red into this mixture. Let's add a little bit more. I want it to go pinker, so I'm going to grab more of the alizarin crimson. A little bit more of that on my palette. So if you're wanting to mix more of a pink, alizarin crimson is going to be the red that you want to do that with because it's a cooler red. So the cool red with a white, which is cool, is going to create a pink. When you try to make a pink with cadmium red, you can, but it's a warmer red. So when you add that warm color with a cool color, it's going to neutralize a bit and kind of look a little brown, a little bit. So let's grab some of this alizarin crimson, add that in there. And of course adding addressing things with color now makes things more complicated because you have to sort of gauge the value and color together. It's not always just straightforward like the grays. You can see I'm having to individualize different parts of these values, especially with the lights on this grapefruit here. There's parts that push cooler and warmer. So now that's too pink, so I have to grab more of my cadmium yellow. So it's kind of just a balancing act, and it just takes some time. Okay, that is a much better. There we go. That's the color I'm looking for. So again, to figure out how to mix these colors, you have to think about those different components of colors. So temperature, chroma, value. That's going to help you. You kind of weigh those in your mind. That's going to help you decide how to mix things out and what colors to begin with, right? So if you're trying to make a really neutral yellow, you don't need to start with a really bright yellow like that. You can start with a more neutral yellow. Okay, so I'm going to take some of this, add it into this one to give myself kind of in between. And I'm also, so that's good, I'm going to mix some white into this one to get that reflected, that highlight color on the grapefruit. More white, so highlights, it's a direct reflection of the light source, so it will go really bright and white. Okay, so I have now mixed out a value scale for both of my different yellows, and I've mixed out chromatic values for them, so keeping the color in there. So it's important that you're not over mixing white into your warm colors. Now I am going to mix out a green for the leaf that is on my new grapefruit for this new grapefruit painting that I'm creating. If you're not working with the reference that has the leaf in it, then you could be done with the demo. If you want to paint the leaf, then you can watch me do that right now. Okay, so I'm again going to start by thinking of the local color that I'm seeing. And it's a fairly warm green, and I'll do my green over here. So blue And I'm going to get some cadmium yellow. And I'm going to get a little bit of the yellow ochre too to neutralize it a bit. So we'll begin with this and see how it looks. And I will be adding white into this to lighten this green, and possibly a little bit of yellow too. And then I can add red into the green to create a neutralized green and to create the shadows for the green. Okay, so this is a good start. Now I'm going to put just a few more values up here. This one will have more white in it, this one will have white and yellow in it. I'm going to put in at least one more value right here. And I'm going to add in a little bit of cadmium red and a little bit of glycerin crimson. And we'll see what that looks like. So oftentimes it's not like I know exactly how to mix something. If I'm encountering a new painting subject, I have to make these assessments and think of the colors I'm thing and think of the color wheel. So I'm starting off looking at this leaf and thinking, okay, how do I mix that shadow color? Thinking of the color wheel. Now I just have to try it out based off of that color theory and see if it is working for me. So I gauge how it's going, looking at this new color I'm making. So I think this one works. There are some warm green parts of the shadow. This is a warm neutralized green. I do want some darker and cooler, one more darker and kind of cooler version of this green though. So what I'm going to do is take some of this mixture down, and I'm going to add a little bit of this cooler neutral into it. Okay, so this is going to be adding some blue into it. The blue might overwhelm this though, so the neutral, adding the cool neutral is a good option. So it's not quite as, wouldn't overwhelm this little color pile that I'm trying to make as much as blue would. Okay, so now I have a cooler, very neutral green. And to get some more parts of the light, this one I'm gonna have be a little bit more chromatic and warm, and I'm gonna lighten it with yellow. Of white into this one as well. So grabbing a little bit of light, a little bit of white. Okay, and then I'm also going to give myself a lighter green with more white in it for right there. Okay, so there is the full mixing demo. Again, always keep in mind that you have to follow along with this, but then also gauge what is happening in your particular painting. Think back to those components of color. Think back to your color wheel, and also be squinting at your value scales that you're mixing to make sure you can see a spectrum going from dark to light. And then also be squinting at your photo reference to assess the value structure there and see that it's represented on your palette. Okay guys, have fun and just email me if you have any questions.